Welcome to another episode of Estate Planning Nightmares and How to Avoid Them. This is the show that highlights the importance of estate planning and why everyone needs to do it. And of course, the unfortunate consequences of what happens far too often if people haven't planned. I'm your host, John Braddock, author of the Amazon bestseller, Click Here When I Die, and founder of My Life in Wishes, an online planning and document storage solution created to make things easier for those you love. Today, we have another exciting episode for you, and I'm thrilled to introduce my friend, Kristen Boone. Let me give you a little background. Kristen is the owner of Boone Legal, an estate planning firm located in Stow, Ohio. Boone Legal serves clients throughout Northeast Ohio and has practiced exclusively in the estate planning field since 2015. Kristen's clients are throughout, she served her clients rather throughout the whole spectrum of estate planning, making it her mission to help people avoid the emotionally and financially draining probate process. Her personal experience in navigating this process after the loss of her own loved one has contributed to a law practice that is not only successful, but also uniquely empathetic. Boone Legal helps people and families create certainty in life's uncertain moments by creating custom estate plans for their clients that will work when you need and your loved ones need them the most. So welcome, Kristen.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome. How are you today?
Good. Thank you so much for having us on.
Oh, it is totally my pleasure. So you're up in Ohio, and we were just chatting before we started
Yes.
to record. It's becoming winter up your way.
We are transitioning, which unfortunately the transition this year was from 85 to about 45 in one day, but that's okay. Nothing unusual here.
Oh, yeah, I hear it. You know the old saying, if you don't like the weather, wait 10 minutes, it's going to change.
There you go. There you go. 100%.
Yeah, but probably for the worst, right?
Well,
Uh,
eh,
uh,
depends on your perspective on what is the worst.
yeah, exactly. You know, I grew up in the Northeast. I love the snow. I used to be a professional skier.
You
Um,
were? I didn't know that.
yes, that we'll do a whole other talk on that at
Oh,
another
that's neat.
time. Uh, many years later, I have bad knees and don't get to do that as much, and I really don't like snow that much anymore. So go figure. Anyway, so great. I'm so happy to have you. You know, I love talking about people's passion. You know, the why behind what it is that people do and why they do it. And, you know, talking about our why, I think is awesome to get our audience to really, know you and understand. So can you share your why? I mean, why you're not a criminal defense attorney or why you're not a, corporate lawyer?
Yeah. It's interesting because I actually started out, I worked in human resources for quite a while before before I went to law school, and then while I was in law school. And I always thought I was going to end up in some form of corporate or human resources type of law when I graduated. But the world has a different plan for you, which is kind of a beautiful thing if you can, roll with that, roll with those punches. So I was working in a manufacturing company. I was an HR manager for 3 plants there, and they eliminated my position one day, and which I remember I was walking out of the plant that day, and this is my position had been eliminated across the board. Like it was me and like this whole like little sector, and I was driving home from that job, and I was a long drive, and I called my mom, and she goes, "Oh, this is great." And I was like, "What? This is not great." And she goes, "Oh, no. You just passed the bar exam. You were kind of thinking you didn't want to do HR anyway. Like, this is great. You have the opportunity to try something different now. And you got a little package with it too." So I love that perspective. I love that she said that. But that is the beginning of the pivot for me into the estate planning arena. Um, I actually then worked for somebody who also exclusively practices in estate planning in Ohio as well. And a couple of years ago, I started my own firm. So here we are. So
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, so we call the show estate planning nightmares and how to avoid them. It's really not about eliciting fear in listeners.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but to get them to understand and think about their own situation and know that bad things happen to good people,
yep,
and there are ways that they can be avoided. um and I know you have a lot of stories, and so I always like to ask, hey, can you share some stories? I mean, could be positive, could be a
yeah,
nightmare that come around. And so I was thinking about a few themes rather, after you and I had chatted earlier. And so, and I think these themes are actually be really beneficial to our listeners. So thank you for suggesting them. So the first one is, can you like discuss or share something about a situation when there's just simply no plan in place?
yes. Yes, I often think about estate planning in the themes that I gave you that we'll kind of go into today. But when people have no plan in place, what happens is the state will actually substitute its judgment for your own, and the your assets will be distributed according to the it's called the statute of descent and distribution. Every state might have a slightly different name for that statute, but in Ohio, it's called the statute of descent and distribution. And I'm going to tell you what this actually can look like for families because it is a huge reason. Talking about a why, is a big reason about how and why we practice the way that we do now. So, my dad actually passed away a couple years ago, and you know, one of my uncles has said to me before, he's like, some people come into your life to teach you a really good lesson, and some people, sometimes that's an easier positive lesson, and sometimes it's a lesson in what not to do. And so a lot of what he kind of did or how he lived his life was maybe some things that you might not want to do. But um, regardless of that, he was loved, even though it was complicated. And he passed away with no plan in place. And as a lawyer, if there's any other lawyers listening, I'm sure that they can empathize with this because or really any small business owner, sometimes your parent is your best client and sometimes your parent is your worst client. So unfortunately, he fell into that later category of, not being a particularly great client, and he had no plan in place. So, what happens when we pass away without a record of what we have or where things are, or there are no documents showing this? Then what you essentially have to do is you take a death certificate. This is what I have had to do for numerous clients. Doing it for my own family really brought a completely different perspective to this. So, but you'll kind of Google, one way to start is Google 5 mile radius around that person's house and see what the closest banks are. And you'll take a death certificate to those banks and say, did this person have accounts here? And if so, did those accounts have beneficiaries? If you have no record of, because a lot of people don't get things in the mail anymore, and my dad was one of them, you don't, we can guess on some of his passwords and things like that. But other than that, you're just either left waiting for tax returns or trying to find a tax return or waiting for the mail or waiting for their assets to pop up on the State Department of Unclaimed Property list, which is going to take a really long time. So um, I unfortunately I had to do this for my dad, and I was standing in that line holding at the bank holding that death certificate, and I was devastated. And it was a different level for me than I knew on um, like a lawyer level, like a learning level of, hey, this is how you go about and do this, and giving people the checklist. But knowing that on a heart level of what that really felt like was just such a difference. And all the things that we had to do as a result of that were um, it just brought a new awareness to my practice, and it brought a new awareness to why this is such an important area of law. So having some very basic documents in place can just really save your family so much of a headache and so much time. So going through that experience, again, his assets had to pass according to the statute of descent and distribution. I had to find all of them and then liquidate them. We have to then ask the probate court for permission to either sell or distribute them as well. So it's a lengthy and it's an expensive process when there are no documents in place. So no
Well,
plan in
it's
place.
yeah. You had me right at the beginning when you said, "Well, the state's going to decide." Whenever someone says my government is now in charge of
Yeah.
something, that's
Yes.
it's like, oh no. And as you know, our story, trying to find things like you say, contacting financial institutions, et cetera. I mean, it's like a scavenger hunt on steroids, right? It
It's a
takes
scavenger
forever.
hunt with an emotional component, which is an absolute disaster.
Right.
It's not. So yeah, do not 10 out of 10, do not recommend.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's funny because you say, like your dad, he didn't, bank statements don't come in the mail, right?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, I always say this, but, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s. And back then, death was pretty easy. Well, don't get me wrong, death's still pretty easy to accomplish all on its own. But closing things out was pretty easy comparatively because everything a person had was going to show up in the mailbox out front of the house eventually the next month or two, right?
Yeah.
Um,
The
Today, I
world was
mean,
smaller. Yeah, the world was
yeah,
smaller. Your banker knew you. You went and
yeah,
deposited your paycheck every 2 weeks or whatever. And yeah.
exactly. Today, I mean, everything's electronic. You know, the inbox is where things arrive, and really the only things that show up in that mailbox. And now we're coming into holiday season. There'll be some Christmas cards out there, but that's about it. So,
Yep.
yeah, super important to have a plan in place, and you think about it. Um, so people then do plan, which is highly important, obviously. And so now I've got a plan, right? I have an estate plan.
Hmm.
I'm all
Great.
good. It's a just set it and forget it kind of thing, right? Never look at it again. So let's talk about what happens if people don't have a plan that's updated.
Yes. Okay. So I have had a couple of cases where people had the best intentions and maybe they made plans. And this is kind of, there's one case in mind that when we talk about this really pops out for me. In the probably it was about the mid 70s, mom and dad had their children and they had, I don't even know if they had both their kids yet, but and a statement that every time I say it, I feel weird, but in this will that was made in the 70s, it left an antique weapon collection to a child that was then 2 years old. And I know it sounds strange today, but they made this will in the 70s. They just, like we said, the world looked different then. Um, the parents, the mom and dad who made that will, this is just maybe in like the mid to 2000s ish. Dad passes away, and this weapon collection has grown to several $100,000 in value. Yeah, it's a primary asset of the estate at this point. They had collected these pieces over time, and it was their intention to sell off sections of this collection, and they actually had a plan to what to sell at certain points as part of their primary retirement assets as well. So the dad died and he left the antique weapon collection to his then 2 year old child, who's now an adult. And the child, there had been some, sometimes when you have a loved one die, people don't always have everybody has a different reaction to it. And sometimes, it brings up some negative strife for families. So unfortunately, the son wasn't cooperating and didn't really want to give the asset back to his mother, even if he could have. Um, which he could not have because he actually owned a small business as well, and that business was not doing well, and he was in the process of filing for bankruptcy. So, part of the bankruptcy process is you gather all of the assets, and then they're assigned to a bankruptcy trustee who then kind of orders distribution or the sale of these assets. So, I'm not a bankruptcy attorney. I don't know a lot about it. I just know that they can order you to sell things. And that is exactly what happened in this case. So the parents had a plan in place, but they never updated the plan. And when the mom came in and she was talking to me, she's like, I had told him for years that we had to change that will. We have to change these wills to take this out because we plan on using these in retirement and selling them. We don't plan on dying with this collection anymore. And if we did, I'm not sure that this is the best person for it to go to. And he didn't get to it in time. He died very unexpectedly. He was relatively young. So having a plan in place, but not updating that plan over time. Unfortunately, estate planning is not a one and done document. You have to update it to reflect who is in your life at that point in time and what are they doing for you? What are the different roles that they need to serve in? So, yeah, that was a really unfortunate case that we dealt with.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I share this frequently. But after my wife Michelle's father had died, and we are on this scavenger hunt trying to find everything. One particular day, several weeks in, I said, "Hey, honey, I've got some good news. I've got some bad news." And she said, "Well, what's the good news?" I said, "The good news is I found the will." She said, "What's the bad news?" I said, "The bad news is apparently you have to move to Milwaukee and live with Aunt Jean and Uncle Ed."
That's exactly right. Yes. Yes, we
So,
update those a
and
lot from 30-year-old
yeah,
children.
you look at it and say, well, this was created in the 60s at some point and stuck in a drawer and never thought of again. So, I mean, it's just kind of an amusing, story, but things do change. And if it's simply a will, people you want to leave things to may change over time, those kind of things. And then, of course, if you have a trust, right, it's really important to review to make sure that, all your assets are properly titled in the name of the trust, because that can.
Yes, that is huge. That is a huge piece of the estate planning process, is keeping that up to date over time.
So I guess the biggest takeaway here is if you have a plan of any sort, be it wills or trust, hopefully trust, because I'm a huge fan of trust.
Yes, as are we. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have one and you haven't reviewed it, review it. It's
Yes.
critically important because none of us have the crystal ball.
Yes, yes. And also, a lot of things that I see too is people are now wanting that their children have grown up and they're, now responsible children, and they would want them to actually be in charge of distributing assets out to, their other loved ones or their siblings or whatever. And it's a whole process if we don't have that, in fact, documented either by will or by trust, preferably by trust. So even these things, these changes are hard. Updating your trustee to your child is a real simple change that does not cost a lot, but we need to keep it up to date over time. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Another big takeaway, I was talking to someone the other day and we were talking about kids, and Michelle and I have 6 children between us. And anyone who has children know this, right? And here's why having an estate plan is important, right? Because family can't agree on anything. I mean, I look back, our kids are out of the house now, but we couldn't all decide what to have for dinner. We couldn't decide what movie to go to. So,
Right.
you flash forward and have a mentality of saying, oh, well, the kids, they'll figure it out. It's like, you didn't like it when your kids fought when you're alive. I can guarantee you, now that they're adults and you're gone, without a plan, there's going to be some fighting like you have never believed.
Yes, and actually that brings up another interesting kind of story that I also wanted to share with you around if you have a plan in place, but you don't really understand the implications of that plan. So if you have a plan, but it doesn't either, like, it doesn't go far enough, or it doesn't take into account your family dynamic, this can also be a huge problem in the estate planning area. So I had a case once, and actually, I've had this case multiple times, but there's something called a transfer on death designation in Ohio that basically what you can do is you can add a beneficiary to your home so that it avoids the probate court process, which is great. That is a great thing to have available, but you need to look at who you're going to leave that house to, and do they get along? Because all you would have to do is file a death certificate and a quick affidavit with the recorder, and then whoever's listed on that transfer on death designation then owns the home. So I had a family that the mom had 5 children. It was a modest home in Canton, and all of those children were married. And Ohio has something called dower rights too, which means that, estate planning is really old law. And dower rights mean that your spouse basically has to sign a deed before your house can transfer if you own that house in your name, if you own it individually. And so we had a committee of 10 that is trying to decide who is going to listing agreement on the house, who's paying the taxes, who's paying the electric bill. Jenny wants to rip out the carpet and totally redo it because she's now having the, DIY fantasy going on. And Aunt on the other side doesn't like any of her picks, but also just has kids in college and is like, hey, I just need to be done with this and I need the money and I just want to move on. And it's an absolute nightmare. And it was the whole point was to avoid the probate court process, but there's people in that family that I know they still don't talk to each other because of this. So when you have a plan in place, I know it is so sad to me. You got to really look at what that plan is going to do, and is that going to work for your family? Other examples where I've seen this is if there's a family or like an heirloom that you have, like one 3-carat diamond ring or one significant piece of artwork, and maybe it has value monetarily, but often we're talking about more of a family value or like a sentimental value around it. And we know that there's going to potentially be some conflict over that. You got to bite the bullet and do the hard thing and leave that to one kid. And you can tell the other kids. I think it's a great idea to tell them while you're alive and say, hey, I picked this kid for this. You may tell a reason, you may not, but hey, I can't split. We can't take our copy of the Constitution and cut it up in 6. So we had to do it for one person, and let's just get that out in the open and have those conversations. So once you're gone, we can't have the conversation anymore, and we're just left with family members speculating, which we all know what that looks like and how that can so contribute to even more strife in an already really sad situation.
Oh yeah, that's the old mom promised the china to both the girls, and they
Yes,
are gonna
yes.
fight over it. So
They are going to
yeah,
fight over the spoons, 100%.
wow, that's amazing. So interesting. Circle back to the transfer on death. So
Hmm.
if someone has a trust and everything is done properly, we're
Hmm.
doing everything we possibly can to avoid probate, which is awesome.
Yes. Yep.
Now, if someone has a will, it's still getting probated,
Correct.
and if someone with a will dies and now it's going to probate, but they owned a home before that person who ultimately will probably get the house, before they could ever sell it, probate has to be complete, and that can take a year, 2 years, depending on the estate. But even if it's a will, if you have a transfer on death on that house, does that take the house out of the probate?
Yes. So it's kind of a poor man's trust is another way that sometimes people think of it in Ohio. Yes, a transfer on death designation, it has to be filed before the death of the homeowner. And it is actually, you can think of it as an attachment to the property record. It's not an actual transfer of the title, but it's like they staple on a piece of paper saying that, hey, at my death, I want my house to go to the people who are named here. So they're functioning in their individual capacity when they inherit that house. Now, if we have a trust, this looks really different. So we would title the house over to the trust in Ohio, which the trust would then become the owner of the home. And instead of having those five kids, fight, or that committee of 10, because they were all married, those five kids fight over the home and who's going to be the listing agent and all that good stuff, the trustee of that trust would actually make all of those decisions. So we have now gone to a committee of one, who you've carefully thought through and picked, and hopefully, if it's the right situation for you, told the other loved ones who you're picking, and one person signing the deed, one person signing the check. They don't have to release their dower rights because they are doing this as the trustee of a trust. They're not functioning in their individual capacity. So it is such a dramatically simplified process that, when we think through our unique family situation and is that transparent death, is it enough? Is that going to work? What's that look like for your family is really important.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, and that is so critical and such valuable information to know too. I had one attorney though who was telling me one day, we were talking about what's the best process to go through, whatever, to name your trustee or your executor, and so he looked at me, he said, name the kid you like the least, because it's a big job. It's a big job.
It is a big job. And even if you're really well organized, that is going to cut down on the time dramatically for it, as you well know. But yeah, there's still some work involved. But I'm telling you, it's a teeny tiny portion of the work that you would be going through the probate court process. And it's funny that you mentioned that too, because you're actually eligible for a fee. It's called a fiduciary fee in Ohio for completing the functioning as an executor or an administrator. And I can almost call it to the day at this point, where family comes in, they all are having a lovely meeting, their loved one has passed, and they're all in agreement. And the executor saying, I would never take that fee. Oh, we'll just all work together and we'll wrap this up and it's not going to be a problem at all. And I can call it about to the day where then I get a phone call that says, tell me about that fee again. This has been a lot more work than I thought it was going to be. And, X, Y, and Z siblings have all gone back to their respective states. And while we're not necessarily fighting, they are not the one here who's looking at this house every Saturday trying to wonder, what are we going to do with all the Hummels? So it's it is a big job.
Oh, exactly. Well, hey, this has been amazing. I really appreciate your time. We're up against time, but let me ask this: is there anything that I didn't ask you that you're thinking, man, I wish you'd asked me that question?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I want to emphasize the importance of revocable living trusts and having your assets documented and where, knowing where they're located, such a critical piece of the estate planning process. But yeah.
Yeah. So for our listeners, and I'm going to post all this in the show notes, but what's the best way for them to reach out to you with general questions? They need some help with estate planning, particularly all our good folks in Ohio.
Yeah, you can visit our website. It's boonelegal.com. That's Boone like Daniel, B as in boy, OONE, legal.com. Feel free to give us a call at 330-968-6003. Also welcome to shoot us an email at info@boonelegal.com.
Awesome. I'll get all that posted in the show notes so our listeners can find you, of course. And Kristen, I can't thank you enough for being on the show today. I know it's been insightful for me. I always learn something new whenever I'm talking with my estate planning attorney friends around the country. And along with my listeners, we're certainly grateful for your time. And a huge thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please feel free to reach out to Kristen. And as always, plan ahead and make it a great day.